interposed. Because of that, I will give you a handicap. Under no circumstance will I use my full strength on you. Part 4. Twin Maximize Magic, Electrosphere. Two balls of lightning, each nearly twice the normal size, appeared in Nabarul's open palms and shot forth. And then they struck. The electrospheres, their destructive power greatly augmented, expanded rapidly. The electrical pulse that spread from them was huge and lit the graveyard as if it was in broad daylight. The magical lightning vanished as quickly as it had appeared, taking its power with it. All of Kazit's minions were on the ground. Only one person remained standing. Really? Why didn't you fall like those other inferior life forms, caterpillars? Could it be that you cast the energy immunity, electricity spell? Nabarul asked as she noticed the faint burn marks on Kazit's face. If those were there, then he should have cast protection energy, electricity, a lower-tiered defensive spell than energy immunity, electricity. Nabarul felt it was a shame that she could not exterminate all the pests in one go, and then she consoled herself with the thought that all this was still within acceptable parameters. After all, it would have been boring to have finished everything off with just one spell. You aren't just a regular idiot, but an idiot who can cast third-tier spells, aren't you? An idiot. An inferior life form might, like yourself, dares call me an idiot. Nabarul wrinkled her eyebrows. Anyone who makes a mess of my plans is an idiot. Especially an idiot who doesn't know the meaning of strength and came here to find their death. My preparations are finally complete. Now behold the supreme power of the orb of death that has drunk its fill of negative energy. Kazit raised the orb in his hand. It was a fairly rough-looking gem that gleamed like a lump of blackened steel. It had not been polished and it looked more like a lump of ore than anything which had been manufactured. Nabarul sensed something like a heartbeat coming from the orb. Suddenly, the 6 disciples of Kazit who had been electrocuted by the electrosphere climbed to their feet, but those were not the motions of a living, thinking creature. The 6 disciples were now under necromantic control, and shakily drew themselves up between Nabarul and Kazit. Nabarul watched the scene before her with doubt and puzzlement in her eyes. These zombies are my opponents. Foo-ha, that's right. But they'll be enough for you. Attack. Zombies, being the least among the undead, could not use magic, and as the half-dozen former disciples lunged at her with claws outstretched, Nabarul cast a spell on them. Electrosphere. Once more a white globe shot forth. Where it struck, it generated a pulse of electricity which consumed all the disciples within its radius. The lightning vanished after a moment, and the disciples collapsed to the ground once more. Although she had easily dispatched her enemy, there was no joy on Nabarul's face. Create undead could not produce multiple undead at once. This must have been the result of Kazit using some sort of support skill. Nabarul turned her gaze to the black sphere in Kazit's hand. It would seem the power of that item extended to letting him control multiple zombies at once. Still, this man had some nerve calling an effect like that. Supreme power. Quote, to Nabarul, the rulers of the Great Tomb of Nazarick, the 41 supreme beings who had created her and all her comrades, were the only entities who deserved to be described as supreme. Just as unhappiness filled Nabarul, Kazit exclaimed in delight. That's enough. You've taken in more than enough negative energy. The black sphere in Kazit's hand drew the graveyard's darkness into itself, and it seemed to be glowing faintly. The slow heartbeat she felt from earlier seemed stronger than before. It would seem that ignoring it would be problematic in the future. Having come to that conclusion, Nabarul was about to make a move when she heard something. It was the sound of something whistling through the air. Nabarul recalled her master's warning and flung herself to the side. A massive creature rushed past Nabral's body, and after hovering behind Kazit, it landed on the ground. It was a composite entity that stood 3 meters tall, made of countless human bones. It was designed to resemble a being with a very long neck, wings, and 4 legs, a dragon. Its tail, also made from innumerable bones, lightly thumped the ground. This was the monster known as a skeletal dragon. Nabral did not consider monsters of its level strong, but the skeletal dragon had a trait which was very dangerous to Nabe. For the first time, a look of surprise appeared on Nabral's face, which then stiffened up. Fuha! Kazit's mad laughter echoed through the surroundings. Skeletal dragons and their absolute immunity to magic are a magic caster's worst nightmare, aren't they? If Nabe could not hurt the skeletal dragon with magic, then her master had ordered her to carry a sword with her in case of emergencies. She now removed it from her belt along with its sheath and then secured her sword so it would not easily slip out of the sheath. "I'll beat you to death." Nabral strode forth. The skeletal dragon swiped its forepaw in response, but Nabral nimbly evaded its attack. The wind of its passing tossed up Nabral's hair as she rushed in at the skeletal dragon's chest. Then, she concentrated all her strength and swung with all her force. Her blow sent the 3-meter-tall skeletal dragon flying. Shortly afterwards, it hit the ground with an earth-shaking crash. What? Kazit's jaw dropped as he stared. Skeletal dragons were made of many smaller bones, and they certainly looked light. However, they only appeared light. Magic casters, who spent their days pursuing greater magic power, should not have had enough strength to pull off a move like that. Kazit hurriedly fled behind the skeletal dragon's vast body, and then he shouted, "You, who are you? A mithril? No, an orichalcum-ranked adventurer. There shouldn't be anyone like that in this city. Did you pursue Clementine or myself to this place?" Kazit grit his teeth in agitation. "Well, panicking like this does suit an inferior life form, click beetle, like yourself. You. Crafting this skeletal dragon had required 2 months of elaborate rituals and an immense quantity of negative energy. How could it be beaten so easily? He had worked and planned many years for this." Just as Kazit was turning red with rage, the skeletal dragon creaked as it slowly got up. There was a massive fissure in the bones which formed its chest, which spilled bone fragments as it moved. It could not take another hit like this. "No, I won't. I won't let you." Ray of negative energy. A beam of black light shone extended from Kazit's hand and touched the skeletal dragon, quickly healing its injuries with negative energy. So it's immune to magic, but it can be healed with magic. Kazit ignored Nabral's mockery and continued casting spells. Reinforce armor, lesser strength, undead flame, shield wall. He cast buff after buff on the skeletal dragon. Now the skeletal dragon's bony body was sturdier, stronger, and wreathed in light gray black fire. It even had an invisible barrier in front of it which acted like a shield. "Well, if you're doing that, I'll play along." Reinforce armor, shield wall, protection energy, negative. Nabral layered defensive spells on herself as well. Once both sides had finished buffing themselves, it was as if a bell had gone off and the two of them went at it again. Nabral swung her sword. She landed a forceful hit on the skeletal dragon's foreleg, but then Nabral furrowed her brows. Although she could easily strike her opposition like just she had earlier, this was hardly a good match-up for her. She was not skilled at melee combat and her weapon was not suitable for it either. The skeletal dragon was made of an assembly of bones, so piercing and slashing weapons did very little damage to it. However, Nabral did not have bludgeoning weapons, which were ideal for the task, so she had to resort to using her sheath. Although she had the advantage, the poor balance of the improvised weapon meant she could not effectively damage the skeletal dragon. Perhaps a specialized warrior might have been able to maintain his balance, but Nabrul was a magic caster and did not know how to do so. The skeletal dragon's forepaw swiped over the crouching Nabrul. Though it missed her with its kick, the black flames wreathing its limbs washed over Nabrul. However, she resisted him with the protection energy negative spell, and the black flames vanished without a trace. If she had not protected herself, she would probably have been hurt by the additional effects of the blow even if she had avoided it. Ray of negative energy. Khazit healed the skeletal dragon's wounds with a magic ray. This was also one of the reasons why Nabrul was frowning. No matter how much damage she did, Khazit the backliner immediately healed it all. She knew she had to attack Khazit first, but the skeletal dragon between Nabrul and Khazit did not permit her to do so. Even a piercing spell like lightning would be stopped by the skeletal dragon's magic immunity. The area effect spell, Electrosphere, would also be stopped by Khazit's defensive magic, its damage reduced to insignificance. Then, perhaps by using an enchantment-type spell, she could force him to lower his defenses and win the encounter in one stroke. Charm Person. Mind of Undeath. Nabrul and Khazit cast their spells at the same time. Nabrul directed a spell which would charm humans at Khazit, while Khazit cast a defensive spell on himself which protected him from mind-affecting spells. In the end, Khazit smiled triumphantly, while Nabrul frowned and clicked her tongue. Perhaps she had been distracted by Khazit's smile, but a shadow appeared over Nabrul's face. A white object filled Nabrul's field of vision. She would be hard-pressed to avoid it. She deftly ducked her head and braced the tip of her sword against her shoulder, turning her sword into a shield. The impact spread through her sword arm and the shoulder which took the blow, practically numbing her entire body and tossing Nabrul's body into the air. This was the result of the skeletal dragon aiming a tail swipe at her face. Oh ho! Though her balance had been broken, Nabrul had not fallen down, her legs skillfully braced against the impact. Still, she had been driven back. This was a good chance for a follow-up attack, but the skeletal dragon remained where it was. Its job was to protect Khazit, and so it could not stray too far from him. After sensing this from the skeletal dragon, Nabrul shook her hands to clear off the numbness and soreness. Just then, Khazit poked his head out from behind the skeletal dragon. Acid Javelin. Lightning. Khazit launched a green, spear-like object that streaked towards Nabrul's body. The javelin, which should have dealt her acid damage, stopped several centimeters away from Nabrul's body and vanished without a trace. At the same time, the lightning bolt Nabrul shot from her fingers was blocked by the skeletal dragon's tail and fizzled out. Khazit and Nabrul glared at each other. A defensive spell. How annoying. That should be my line, you inferior lifeform, bagworm moth. How about coming out from behind there and facing me fair and square? And why do I have to come out? Doesn't staying here ruin your plans? Khazit knew that Nabrul had his number and narrowed his eyes. Nabrul smiled nonchalantly. It can't be helped. After making his decision, Khazit clutched the strange sphere and raised it to the heavens. Now behold the power of the Orb of Death. The earth trembled, and Nabrul's body shook as well. This was a sign that something big was coming. A massive fissure appeared in the ground, and a white monster slowly revealed itself. Another one. HMPH. The negative energy's depleted now, but after I kill you and your friend, I can spread death throughout the city and recover it all. Khazit's shouting was angry and emotional, in contrast to the unfazed Nabrul. Hya! Nabrul forcefully exhaled, then sprinted forward with preternatural speed. Khajiit was taken by surprise and could not react in time. The skeletal dragons stomped at Nabrul, who had entered their attack range, with their forelegs. Nabrul turned and evaded the stomp of the skeletal dragon on her right, but the other one was waiting for her. It swept its tail along the ground, like it was going to scythe the grass. The tail, which had nearly hit her, thundered through the air in front of Nabrul as she leapt a long way back. Then, the tail suddenly changed its direction, swinging down on Nabrul, who had just jumped clear. Nabrul avoided the earth-shaken blow from the left, but the skeletal dragon on the right swiped its forepaw at her as well. Grr! She raised her sword to block the skeletal dragon's swipe. Although the paw's crushing pressure was extraordinary, Nabrul still stood strong underneath it, and even forced it away. The right-side skeletal dragon stumbled several steps back, causing a brief lull in the action. "What are you blocking it without martial arts? How did you learn to do that?" "It is because I was created by the ones who are greater than the gods, the supreme beings." "Are you kidding me? Even if you knew the truth, you would never understand, and to think you would go so far as to call me, one who spoke the name of the supreme beings, an idiot. This is why I say human beings are inferior life forms, planarians." Nabrul turned a keen glare on Khajiit. It was a cold, piercing stare that made him want to back away from her. The frightened Khajiit gave an order, as though to wipe away his fear. "Skeletal dragons, get her." The skeletal dragons kept within range of Khajiit and made their move. Nabrul evaded the attack of one of the skeletal dragons and moved to close in, but she was forced to avoid the other skeletal dragon's attack and missed her chance. This back and forth played out for quite a while, until a decisive blow was struck. Acid javelin. Nabrul subconsciously turned her head and avoided the magical javelin headed at her face. That was a grave mistake. The attack would not have done anything even if it had hit, so she could have safely ignored it. However, it came right at her, so she evaded it by reflex. This was a mistake that only a magic caster, who had not improved their close combat ability, would make. That mistake had grave consequences. Whoosh! Nabrul's field of view changed dramatically as an ear-splitting impact rang out. She was tossed to the side. She experienced a brief period of weightlessness before falling heavily to the ground. Her left arm had taken a tail sweep from one of the skeletal dragons. The non-stop spinning disoriented her and she had no idea where she was. Her body was protected by all manner of defensive spells, so there was no pain. However, the two skeletal dragons raised their forelegs over Nabrul. One might say she was out of options, normally speaking. "Surrender, and I'll spare your life. How about it?" A sadistic grin bloomed on Khajiit's face, as he assured himself of his impending victory. Of course, Khajiit was not going to spare her. That look on his face was the kind that looked forward to the girl begging for mercy before he trampled her pathetic form. Nabrul, who had raised her torso off the ground, was so furious that her face was twisted up. "Terrible. Human. What?" Nabrul looked Khajiit in the eye and said, "You miserable little human being. How dare you utter such nonsense, you pile of trash." Khajiit's eyes went wide and he shuddered with rage, and he gave the order to finish her off. "Destroy her, skeletal dragons." The two dragons raised their forelegs, and Nabrul smiled. The words of the man she revered had reached her ears. She would hear him, no matter how far away his voice was. "Nabrul Gamma. Display the power of Nazarick." "Understood. Then, I shall no longer face you as Nabe, but as Nabrul Gamma." The skeletal dragons brought their forelegs down, intending to crush Nabrul's body beneath their forepaws. At the very last moment, Nabrul cast a spell before being reduced to paste. Teleportation. Narbral's field of vision immediately changed. She was now about 500 meters in the air. Without wings to keep her aloft, Narbral plummeted toward the ground. The wind shear roared across her body and the ground drew close. Narbral laughed. Fly. Her rate of descent slowed and then stopped, until Narbral hung in the air, looking down on the battlefield from just now. Khazit and the two skeletal dragons looked around in shock, as Narbral was nowhere to be found. I'm tired. Clementine's flighty words filtered into Ains's ears. They had been fighting for several minutes, but Ains's great swords had not once touched Clementine. Speaking of which, that's some amazing physical ability you've got there. You might even be proud of it, boo. Her expression turned into a predatory grin. Are you stupid? You're just swinging your swords with raw strength and speed, wildly swiping around like a kid with a stick. You might have a sword in each hand, but if you don't know how to use them, then sticking to one sword would be wiser. Aren't you taking the warrior business a little too lightly? Come at me, then. Haven't you been doing nothing but dodging since just now? It won't be good for you if you drag this out for too long, no. Ains chuckled coldly as he replied to her. Clementine furrowed her brows. He had her there. Clementine had not attacked Ains. Instead, she had been dodging his attacks, and that was because Ains's extraordinary physical attributes did not give her an opening to attack. Things were not as easy for Clementine as she had claimed. She was beginning to feel angry at herself for not being able to take the initiative and strike. You said no warrior could beat you, right? Where's that confidence of yours fled to? Clementine finally went to her weapons after Ains taunted her. She had 4 of the piercing weapons called stilettos at her waist, as well as a morning star. Right now, she drew one of those stilettos. With his superhuman eyesight, Ains verified that the morning star was covered in detritus that looked like blood and chunks of flesh. Ains tightened his grip on the great swords in his hands as he stared down Clementine. Just as both sides were about to strike, the earth shook. Ains could not take his eyes away from Clementine, who had taken a fighting stance. He sneaked a glance to the side, and saw that there were 2 gigantic dragon-shaped monsters made of bone where Narbral was fighting. Skeletal dragons. Huh? Correct, looks like you do know a thing or two. Yup, they're the bane of any magic caster. I see. So that's why Nabe can't win. Indeed it is, Clementine replied in a mocking tone of voice. She seemed to have regained her composure after the skeletal dragons showed up. Ains furrowed his illusory brows under his helmet. It was true that skeletal dragons were tricky opponents for magic casters, and now there were 2 of them. Narbral, as she was now, could not possibly beat them. As though sensing the agitation in Ains's heart, Clementine shifted slightly. This was a move that was intended to seal off his movements, so there would probably be a follow-up to it. When one saw a weakness in a powerful opponent, it would be natural to take the chance and attack. Ains cast all thoughts of Narbral from his mind and thrust forth the greatsword in his left hand in an intimidating manner. It was a feint as he slowly raised the greatsword in his right hand in preparation for a powerful strike. Clementine's weapons were a piercing type, and they could not execute complex attacks like slashing weapons could. They were weapons that were optimized for charges. In addition, stilettos were slender and were certainly not strong enough to survive a clash with greatswords. Because of that, Ains used his left-hand greatsword to keep her at bay, waiting for Clementine to close in. However, Clementine knew what he was up to. Do you have any way to close this gap? I wonder. Clementine had a smug, self-assured look on her face as she responded in her usual self-assured tone. All of this pointed to the fact that she had something up her sleeve. Clementine slowly changed her posture, lowering herself into what seemed like a runner's crouch. However, her body was still upright, so she looked very strange. It might have appeared comical, but this was definitely not the sort of stance one could take lightly. And then Clementine moved. Before Ains's vigilant eyes, Clementine shot out like a fully compressed spring. She sprinted right at him. It was a charge that even Ains, with his superhuman physical abilities, could hardly believe was possible. Like a hurricane that devoured everything in its path, Clementine closed the distance between them in an instant. She slid under the greatsword Ains was holding out, her physical dexterity allowing her to maintain her full speed as she moved. Ains, who was shaken by Clementine's serpentine movements, forcefully swung his right-hand sword. The powerful stroke ripped through the air as it surged toward Clementine, promising unimaginable devastation if he connected. And in that brief instant, Ains saw the face-splitting grin on her face get even wider. Invulnerable fortress. The unbelievable sight took Ains aback. The slender stiletto had actually blocked a hit from a greatsword that was more than 10 times its mass. The stiletto should have snapped under the grand strike it had just blocked head-on. Even if it had remained intact by some miracle, it would have been knocked flying. However, it was Ains's greatsword which bounced away, like it had struck some ridiculously strong castle wall. As though throwing herself into a lover's embrace, Clementine rushed toward Ains's unguarded chest. In that moment, half of Ains's field of view was taken up by the grinning Clementine. Ains retreated, but his opponent was faster. This attack, which combined a full tilt charge, all her strength, and skillful use of momentum, could be described as meteoric. There was a flash of light, and then the screeching of metal clashing with metal rang through the graveyard. Clementine ducked the wild swing of Ains's left-hand sword and then sprang clear. Ains knew the secret behind Clementine's flashy moves. Martial arts, huh? These were techniques which did not exist in YGGDRASIL. They could be said to be a warrior's magic, and they were things of which he had to be wary. Its effect seemed to be to defend against his greatsword hit and neutralize the weapon's impact. She must have used martial arts to deflect Ains's attack. So hard. What's that armor of yours made of? Adamantite. Although he did not feel pain, he felt that something sharp had pierced his left shoulder, near the place where he had heard the sound of scraping. Ains glanced to the shoulder from where the impact had come, but there was only a slight dent in the armor. Although the armor had no special magical properties, it was still the product of a level 100 magic caster's spells. The armor's hardness increased with its creator's level, so the fact that there was a dent in the armor was testament to the destructive power of Clementine's strikes. Oh well, if that's the case, next time maybe I should hit somewhere with thinner armor. Although I wanted to wear you down bit by bit, then slowly torment you once you couldn't move. What a shame, what a shame. Ains realized that Clementine had not been wildly attacking his shoulders, but aiming to disable his arms in order to render him incapable of attacking. For the first time, Ains felt something like respect toward Clementine the warrior. All Ains could do was simply swing his swords and deal damage to the enemy. Of course, if he could hit at all, the enemy would assuredly be slain. However, against a skilled opponent, he had to carefully consider the flow of the battle. This has been good trying for me. Then I'm coming. Just as Ains was admiring Clementine, she took that strange stance she had assumed from just now. In response, Ains raised his right-hand greatsword to meet the attack. This time, however, he did not thrust forth his left-hand greatsword. Clementine snorted at Ains's stance and sprinted. She was so fast that even Ains and his incredible dynamic vision could barely follow her. If she had not rushed straight at him, he might have lost track of her movements. In the face of Clementine's full-tilt charge, like an ominous arrow headed straight at him, Ains swung his right-hand greatsword, launching an attack of his own to intercept her invulnerable fortress. The swing was deflected by the same martial art as before, but he had already predicted this. Ains had lost his balance in the previous exchange because he had put all his strength into the blow, so this time, he did not use as much force. Ains absorbed the radiating impact as though he had struck a wall with the strength of his arm, and then he swung his left-hand greatsword. This time, Ains was fully confident that his foe could not block another full-power hit. However, even faster than that, Clementine used another martial art. Flow acceleration. This martial art had a startling effect. It felt as though someone had used time-controlling magic to slow time down. Everything moved slowly, as though immersed in some highly viscous fluid. The speed of Ains's swing slowed to a crawl. However, Clementine moved at the same speed in this decelerated world. She effortlessly dodged Ains's counterattack, and approached Ains from the front. This might have been some sort of misperception on Ains's part. The magic rings which Ains wore should have protected him from temporal attacks and attacks designed to impede his freedom of movement, although there might be some unknown factor at work here. He must have felt like she had accelerated all of a sudden because his battle with Clementine was so intense. The important thing was that Ains had seen this martial art before, but he had not felt the same way back then. Gaze. Gazef Stronov had used this technique before. Before he could finish speaking, the name of her stiletto stabbed at him. It was aimed at one of Ains's eyes, through the narrow vision slit of his helmet. Ains forcefully jerked his head to the side, and while he managed to evade the stiletto thrust, the sound of metal shrieking against metal echoed through his helmet. Before he could breathe a sigh of relief that he had avoided the worst of it, he glimpsed Clementine readying her stiletto for another attack out of the corner of his eye. Che. Even after factoring in the differences in their physical abilities, Clementine's straight-line thrust was faster than the circular swing of Ains's greatsword. This time, the stiletto struck home, hitting Ains dead on. Goo. A surprised voice and a panicked voice hit the air at the same time. Ains pressed his greatsword against his helmet, and jumped far back, but there was no follow-up attack. Clementine glanced at Ains's unsightly retreat, then looked curiously at the tip of her stiletto. With a mocking laugh, she said, "That's enough of that handicap stuff. If you don't go all out, you're going to die." And then, to clear up her own doubts, Clementine continued asking the silent Ains, "Still, how did you do it? I know I hit you, but you're fine. I thought I would have hurt you with that. Good grief. I've learned a lot from this battle. First, about these things called martial arts, and also, the fact that I can't swing my swords around blindly during combat, and the importance of maintaining my balance while attacking. Are you an idiot? If you've only learned that now, then you're a failure as a warrior. Oh well, it doesn't matter since you're going to die here, though I'd like an answer to my question. Was it some sort of defensive martial art?" Clementine's tone showed that she had had it with Ains. He, on the other hand, smiled bitterly under his helmet, because he agreed with what she had said. "No, you're right. I really am unskilled. You have my thanks. Although, since time is tight, playtime is now over." Paying no heed to the doubt on Clementine's face, Ains shouted at the top of his voice, "Nabral Gamma! Display the power of Nazarick." He swiveled the sword hilts in his hands and then stabbed the points of both his great swords into the ground. Ains extended his empty hands before him, and gently beckoned Clementine over. "Now then, come at me with the intent to die." So, you can use the fly spell. Looks like you're not bluffing. Although, how did you avoid that last hit? I didn't see you behind the skeletal dragons. That puzzled question reached Nabrul, who was slowly descending from the heavens. Khazit had no idea why she had not used the fly spell to escape. She could have done so when encountering the skeletal dragons, but she had not. It baffled him. HMPH, you think you can win against skeletal dragons, who are immune to magic? There are any number of ways to win. But before that, Nabrul grabbed at her shoulder and pulled off her robe. Rejoice, inferior life form, human. You have the honor of doing battle with Nabrul Gamma, one of the battle maids, Pleiades, who are the loyal servants of Ainzul Gaon, the absolute ruler of the Great Tomb of Nazarick. Her equipment was completely different. She now wore gauntlets and greaves of gold, silver, and black metal, as well as a set of maid-themed armor which looked like it had come out of a manga. In place of a helmet, she wore a maid's white-brimmed headdress. In her hands she held a staff of gold inlaid with silver. Player-made items in YGGDRASIL could have their abilities changed by using data crystals. Nabrul's robe had a quick-change crystal embedded in it, so she could directly swap out her gear for a set of predetermined equipment without having to waste time changing. Her cast-off robe now occupied the pocket dimension where they had been. Khazit narrowed his eyes in puzzlement as he saw the maid before him, and when he finally realized what was going on. "What?" he exclaimed in surprise. Of course he would have been taken aback when the magic caster before him turned into a maid. Although he was annoyed by her nonsensical get-up, Nabrul's serene expression filled Khazit with a sense of danger. He immediately ordered the skeletal dragons to attack. The two skeletal dragons drew close to Nabrul with surprising speed, swinging their forepaws, which were made of countless bones. Before they could strike home, Nabrul cast a spell. Dimensional move. That again. Once more, Nabrul vanished without a trace. Khazit looked to the sky to look for the missing Nabrul as he thought of what had happened earlier. However, it was his pain that told him where Nabrul was. "Yeah." Khazit's wail resounded throughout the graveyard. A searing pain pierced Khazit's left shoulder, and the pain spread through his body with the pulse of his heartbeat. A shocked Khazit looked at the wound, at the sharp blade that protruded from the wound. "Gah, gah." Nob Khazit. JPEG. In the next moment, the blade was savagely withdrawn, and pain washed over him again. The sensation of something scraping his bones filled his body, made worse by the agony that gripped him. Thick blood gushed from the wound, starring his black robe. Drooling from the intense pain, Khazit jerked his head back to see what was going on. All he saw was Nabrul, looking at him curiously. Did it hurt that much? Nabrul was holding a black-bladed dagger in the hand that was not holding her staff. Khazit was in so much pain that he could not speak. Magic casters typically shunned the front line, and Khazit was the sort who was served by and dealt out pain to others. Thus, pain was not a common experience for him, which was why his tolerance for it was so low. Oily sweat beading on his forehead, Khazit issued a mental command to the skeletal dragons. Nabrul fell back, drawing away from the approaching skeletal dragons. The fly spell was faster than the running speed of the normal man. The two skeletal dragons charged into the space left by Nabrul. After hiding in the safe space behind the skeletal dragons, Khazit's calm returned to him, and he finally understood the kind of spell Nabrul had used. That was, so it was teleportation magic. Dimensional Move was a third-tier spell, but to magic casters, it was an escape spell used to put distance between themselves and their adversaries. However, that was only the case for magic casters, who were an unathletic lot. For a magic caster with fighting prowess that was on par with a warrior, that spell was arguably more valuable than even a weak attack spell, given that it was very difficult to defend against. Khazit pressed down on his shoulder and glared at Nabrul. I see, so you were planning to kill me with teleportation. You must have escaped with teleportation as well just now. Indeed, it was a tricky trump card to deal with. Since magic was useless against the skeletal dragons, the sensible thing was to kill the controller. In addition, with Nabrul's skillful use of teleportation, Khazit would have a very hard time dodging. However, Nabrul casually answered, "How could that be?" Khazit could not comprehend what she was saying for a moment, and blinked non-stop. Nabrul returned the short sword to its sheath, and began explaining. I was simply demonstrating that I could kill you easily. Nabrul had shown him how she could turn a thoroughly unfavorable situation around, but she had completely abandoned that method. Khazit had no idea what she was up to. Are you mad? Granted, you are an inferior life form, flea, but what kind of answer is that? Use that head of yours a little. Khazit shuddered as he saw Nabrul's cold glare. He was not trembling in anger, but in fear. Unease welled up within Khazit's mind. Well, it's about time to wrap this up. As a servant, it would be rude of me to keep Pain-sama waiting. You seem to think magic is useless against skeletal dragons. Then, I shall enlighten you, inferior life form, Surefly. The fee for that lesson will be your life. She released her staff and clapped her hands together. As she drew them apart again, tongues of white lightning arced between them. They took the form of dragons, and the air around them began glowing and crackling with energy. The white radiance seemed to engulf Nabrul. Khazit stared, at a loss for words. He could understand that this was a mighty spell that exceeded his own frame of reference. Amidst the actinic white radiance, the cold smile on Nabrul's face branded itself onto his eyes. The massive bodies of the skeletal dragons loomed before him. As he recalled their existence, an alarm screamed within him. You think you can beat skeletal dragons, who are immune to all magic? Go. Kill her. Khazit's shouted order was laced with a panic he could no longer hide. As the two skeletal dragons drew close, Nabrul laughed. It was the laugh of a merciless master correcting her foolish pupil. Immune to all magic. It's true that skeletal dragons resist magic, but that ability only applies to spells of the 6th tier and below. The skeletal dragons would not reach Nabrul for some time yet. During that delay, the strangely calm Khazit finally realized the meaning of Nabrul's words. In other words, skeletal dragons cannot resist the spells of a higher tier which I, Nabrul Gamma, can use. She was not lying. That was what Khazit's instincts told him. In other words, this woman could eliminate the skeletal dragons and slay Khazit as well. Why? My sweat and blood of 5 years, gone in less than an hour. As Khazit let out that mournful wail, countless scenes flashed through his mind, as though he were viewing a zoetrope. Khazit Dale Bidantel. Born in a village on the outskirts of the slain theocracy, his mother was a calm, serene woman while his father had a strong body from working in the village. His childhood was mundane. The reason why he had ended up like this was because he had seen his mother's corpse. That day when the setting sun was clearly visible in the sky, Khazit panted as he ran home. His mother wanted him back earlier, but he had been late because of small things he could not clearly recall. Looking for pretty stones outside the village, playing at being heroes while wielding sticks, all these insignificant things had come together and delayed him. He ran home, afraid that his mother would scold him, but when he got there, he found his mother collapsed on the ground. He could still clearly remember the warmth of his mother's body when he rushed over to touch her. He thought it was just a joke, but things turned out otherwise. Kazut's mother had already departed this world. According to the clerics, she had died because she had a blood clot in her brain. In other words, it was nobody's fault. Nobody was to blame. No. Kazut felt that someone was responsible. That someone was himself. If only he had returned home earlier, he might have been able to save his mother. There were many divine magic casters in the slain theocracy, and there were quite a few in Kazut's own village. If only he had begged them for help, perhaps his mother might be well, and still smiling at him. The person who had caused his beloved mother's face to twist in agony was none other than himself. Kazut made up his mind to atone for his misdeed. In other words, he would bring his mother back to life. Yet, the more magic he learned, the bigger the problems he encountered. There was a resurrection spell in the 5th tier of divine magic, but that spell could not resurrect his mother. Resurrection expended a tremendous amount of life force on the part of the dead person, and the deceased who lacked sufficient life force would not be resurrected, but reduced to ash and dust. His mother did not have the necessary vitality, nor did he have the time need to research a new resurrection spell. However, if he abandoned his humanity and became undead, he might be able to buy himself enough time to eventually develop a new spell to raise the dead. That was the conclusion which Kazut had arrived at. He abandoned the divine magic he had studied all his life, and stepped on the path of using arcane magic to become undead. However, there were still obstacles in his way. After walking the path of an arcane magic caster, he would still need a very long time to become a high-tier undead creature, even after forsaking his humanity. And of course, there might be obstacles in his way, in the form of talent and ability, and he might not even be able to become undead in the first place. One of the ways to overcome these obstacles was to gather a massive amount of negative energy, yes. By killing an entire city's worth of people and turning them into undead in order to harness the negative energy they would generate. And then, just as his wish was nearly granted, another obstacle appeared in his way. I spent 5 years preparing in this city. I've held on to this dream for 30 years. What gives you the right to destroy all of this? You, who appeared out of nowhere. Kazut's cry was answered by cold laughter. I have no interest in the dreams of inferior life forms, you. Although, your so-called effort did manage to make me laugh. Still, I do have some words for you. Well done on becoming a stepping stone for Ain-sama. Twin maximize magic, chain dragon lightning. A roaring, coiling stream of dragon-shaped lightning appeared around both of Nabarul's hands. The lightning discharges were wider than her arms, and they struck the skeletal dragons. The vast white bodies shuddered from the impact. The twin lightning blasts wrapped around the skeletal dragons' bodies, burning the false life that animated their corpses out of existence. The end came in an instant. Under the power of the magic lightning, the skeletal dragons and their supposed absolute immunity to magic were torn asunder. Even though the skeletal dragons had been disintegrated, the lightning strikes did not disappear. The 2 arcs of dragon-shaped lightning seemed to be searching for their quarry, then they raised their heads and sprang at their final prey. Kazut's vision was obliterated in a sea of white. He had no time to beg for mercy, nor did he have time to scream. The tears at the corners of his eyes flashed into steam, leaving behind a whispered, "Mum." The searing light consumed Kazut, and the lightning pierced him without mercy. Kazut's body went into full-body seizures, as though he were performing some strange dance where he stood. The current penetrated deep into Kazut's body, and ignited him from the inside. After it had vanished, the smoking Kazut collapsed to the ground. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. Nabarul shrugged, and muttered something to the pile of scorched meat that had once been Kazut. Even inferior life forms, insects, smell good after they've been roasted. I wonder if it would be fine to give him to Entama as a present. A mocking smile came over Nabaral's face as she mentioned the name of her human-eating colleague. The warrior spread his arms, as if he were going to hug someone. Now what tricks are you up to? Giving up already? Giving up? Since I've given Nabaral her orders, I should wrap things up here as well. ch4worldaudio.com. What? What nonsense are you babbling? You think you can beat the great Clementine without any martial arts? You're pissing me off. I have to say, the ravings of a weakling like yourself are quite impressive. Clementine wanted to retort with, that would be you, right? But she suppressed the boiling rage in her heart. The man before her did not have much in the way of combat skills, but he possessed superhuman physical abilities. As far as she knew, said abilities were second only to those of the two godkin, the Black Scripture's extra seat and its first seat, who was also the Black Scripture's leader. Therefore, the way he swung his weapons at his whim became an unpredictable attack and defense, and if she was not careful, she might be killed in a single blow. Clementine faked her usual sneer, and taunted him in turn. Forget it. You're right, we should wrap things up quickly. Morn the warrior simply shrugged. Clementine eyed his stance. There were openings everywhere in his stance, but that could not possibly be all there was to him. It was a trap. However, Clementine had no choice. Her words from earlier might have sounded like a joke, but she meant them. She could probably escape from here by borrowing the power of the skeletal dragons, but that was only if she did not waste any more time. Though she had come along to avoid the agents of the Windflower Scripture, she had wasted too much time on playing. Clementine slowly sank into a crouch, strengthening her grip on her stiletto. She had to finish this fight quickly, preferably with a single stroke. Part of that was because she no longer had time to waste, but it was also because the attacks and parries of the man before her were gradually becoming more and more competent. It would be best to kill him now before he grew to a point where she could no longer do so. Clementine exhaled loudly and then she surged forward. Gale stride. Greater evasion. Ability boost. Greater ability boost. Those were the same 4 techniques she had used earlier, in an attempt to shrink the gap between their physical abilities. In addition, she still had room to use other techniques, no matter what Morn tried. In this high-speed world, she was fully aware of anything her opponent could do. He might draw his swords from the ground to attack, or use a martial art, or an unarmed strike, or a hidden weapon. No, he might use a thrown weapon instead. Clementine guessed that there were dozens of tactics her foe could employ, and she was confident that she could defeat each and every one of them. However, every single one of her guesses fell short of the mark. Because her opponent did nothing. The Dark Warrior stretched out his arms, waiting for the attack. A shiver ran down her spine. This was the fear of something beyond her imagination, a fear of the unknown. Should she charge bravely forward, or back off and flee? Those were the only 2 options left to her. Clementine was cruel and merciless, but she was no fool. In that fraction of a second, she worked out countless possibilities and countermeasures. In the end, it was her pride and her confidence in her abilities which spurred Clementine on. Though she had betrayed them, she had once been a member of the slain theocracy's strongest special operations group, the Black Scripture. There were probably less than 10 warriors who could defeat her. It was unthinkable that she should flee from Morn, an unknown fighter with hardly any skills to speak of. Once she made her decision, the rest was easy. There was no need to hesitate any further. As she recovered the composure of a first-rate warrior, Clementine sprinted for Morn's chest so fast it seemed they were going to embrace each other. Die. Using all the muscles in her body, Clementine thrust her stiletto into the vision slit of Morn's full helm. Then she twisted it, as though intending to cause further damage to the surrounding organs while driving it deeper into his head. All this was to inflict a fatal blow. Although his armored hands drew closer, as if to hug her, she paid it no heed and followed up on her attack. In keeping with Clementine's desire to deal a fatal strike, she unleashed the spell stored within the stiletto. That spell was called Lightning. Lightning bolts shot through Ains's body. Clementine's weapons possess a magic accumulate enchantment. She could store a spell within the weapon and release it later. Although the act of doing so would expend the spell, that stored spell could be just about any sort of magic. Thus, it was a handy enchantment which allowed her to prepare for just about any situation with the right stored spell. She drove the stiletto deep into his skull and then released a lightning attack on top of it. This was certainly a fatal blow. However, I'm not done yet. Flow acceleration. Even faster than before, she drove another stiletto into the full helm's vision slit, and then released the fireball spell locked within. In her mind, Clementine saw Morn's body burning within his armor, and she imagined she could smell his scorched and blackened flesh. However, Clementine's eyes went wide in shock, as she was confronted by an unexpected sight. I see. Why GGDRASIL did not have magic weapons like this. Well, this is an eye-opener. Despite having stilettos stabbed through both his eye sockets, Ains was still muttering casually to himself. Clementine then realized that there had been no blood when she stabbed him. No way. Impossible. Why aren't you dead? She had never heard of a martial art like this which could make people invincible. Or had he used some other method to deal with her stabs? If that were the case, how had he stopped the follow-up magical attacks? Even a hardened veteran like Clementine had no answer to those questions. Clementine's body was swallowed in an embrace, and she was now pressed against Morn. The adventurer's plates rattled. Shall I tell you the answer? The jet-black full plate vanished, revealing a terrible face beneath. It was a fleshless skull. Her stilettos protruded from his empty eye sockets through the black mirror shades covering him, but it did not seem to be in the slightest bit of pain. Clementine knew what that face meant. Undead. An elder lich. Well, I had a lot of questions to ask you, but I guess not. All I can say is that your answer came quite close. Then, the monster before her had neither skin nor flesh, and so it should not have an expression on its face. Yet, Clementine had the feeling that it was smiling at her. How does it feel? How does it feel to fight a magic caster with sword in hand? How does it feel to be unable to finish things in a heartbeat? Don't look down on me. Clementine used all her strength to struggle free, but she was held immobile, as though by sturdy chains. Elder liches were powerful undead who were skilled in the use of magic attacks, but their physical abilities were not very impressive. Clementine should have had the advantage. However, she could not get free. Once she realized that the mighty arm which held her, in other words, his physical strength, was not the result of his armor's enchantment, Clementine froze. What she saw in her mind was a butterfly trapped in a spider's web, with no way out. This is what I meant by a handicap. Simply put, there was no need for me to go all out, that is to say, cast a spell against an opponent like you. Son of a bitch. Well then, since the truth's out, let's begin. But first, these are in the way. There was a grinding sound as the elder lich pulled out the stilettos which had been stabbed into its eyes and cast him aside. As the undead creature did this, Clementine was still struggling for dear life, but even her full strength could not compare to the power in just a single arm of his. All she could do was squirm helplessly within his embrace, unable to move. After the two stilettos were drawn out, an evil red light remained in those empty eye sockets. They looked down on the panting, gasping Clementine as she exerted herself. "Now then, shall we begin?" Clementine, who was on guard against anything her opponent might try to pull ever since she heard the word begin, felt herself being drawn nearer to the elder lich, closer than even lovers were. After that, she heard a strange creaking sound. Clementine understood what the elder lich was doing as a chill ran down her spine, as though she had been impaled by an icle. "No. No way, you bastard." The creaking sound was the bending of armor. He was planning to crush her flat against his own chest. Of course her own armor would press against the elder lich's chest, but he must have used some method to harden his own body. His immovable body was like a sturdy, thick wall. "Perhaps if you were weaker." The elder lich withdrew a dagger from somewhere. It was black, with 4 jewels set into its hilt. "I thought about using this to finish you off. But well, isn't it all the same if you get stabbed to death by a sword, die by having your spine broken, or get crushed to death? In the end, you die." Clementine's body shuddered. His casual tone caused panic to bloom in her heart, and the crushing pressure on her chest grew. The metal plates taken from the adventurers she had killed could no longer bear the strain, and they scattered to the ground like they were being buried. The first to fall were the 4 silver plates which she had recently acquired. It was frightening how it was becoming more and more painful to breathe. She hated the arm at her back, the one which held her. She resented herself for wearing light armor to increase her evasive ability and to display her adventurer's plate trophies. Clementine knew that swords were useless against the elder lich, and so she punched wildly at his face. However, that hurt Clementine more than it did him. Then, as the pain set in, she reached for her morning star to maul him, but she was not used to wielding it and injured herself instead. She could clearly see the fate awaiting her. From her, the act of breathing was getting more and more difficult, the ever-increasing pressure on her belly, her slowly deforming armor. She knew exactly what was going to happen to her. "Don't bother struggling. Do you think I can't end this quickly just by changing where my arm is pressing? You took your time killing him, so I'm going to take my time killing you as well." Clementine desperately flailed at him. She tried to push his face away, scratched at him until her nails nearly came off, even tried biting him, but nothing she did worked, and the unbearable pressure kept increasing. No matter how hard she struggled, she could not break free of the arm binding her. Even so, Clementine kept squirming, betting everything for a slim chance at hope even as it became difficult to breathe and her vision began blacking out. Is this the dance of death? She did not even have the strength to hear those whispered words. There was the sound of retching, and then vomit spewed over Ains's body. The scarlet points of light in Ains's eyes dimmed slightly. Clementine, who had been desperately swinging her arms about in the hope of escaping, was now a spasming lump of meat. Still, Ains did not loosen his grip, but tightened it further. Soon, the feeling of thick bones breaking ran up through Ains's arms. He released the body, which could not even twitch anymore. Clementine's body thudded heavily on the ground, like a sack of rubbish. Her face was a hideous blend of agony and terror. Like a deep-sea fish brought up to the surface, one could see her internal organs in her mouth. Ains took out his pitcher of endless water, and used its ever-flowing stream of clean water to rid himself of the vomit that stuck to his body. At the same time, he spoke casually to Clementine, who could no longer answer him. "I forgot to tell you, but I am a terrible hypocrite.